When the seventh day arrived, I brought out a dove, setting it free. Off went the dove. No perch was available for it, and it came back to me. I brought out a swallow, setting it free. Off went the swallow. No perch was available for it, and it came back to me. I brought out a raven, setting it free. Off went the raven, and it saw the waters receding. It was eating, bobbing up and down. It did not come back to me. If you've ever heard the biblical story of Noah and the flood, then this passage probably sounds pretty familiar to you. It's not from the Bible. This is a section of the Mesopotamian flood narrative as found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Mesopotamian flood narrative heavily influenced the writers of the flood account in Genesis, leading some people to label Noah's adventures in the Bible as plagiarism, something that Western society frowns upon as being dishonest and unimaginative. But was this actually plagiarism? Join me in this video series to look at the use of intertextuality in ancient literature and to find out what makes this, and other examples, more than simply copying someone else's creative property. Like, subscribe, come along for the ride. In the introduction to this video, I used two terms, plagiarism and intertextuality, somewhat interchangeably. While similar, they actually have two distinct ranges of meaning, and because I'm an academic and I want to be clear, I'm going to take a minute to define my terms. Plagiarism is defined by Merriam-Webster as stealing or passing off someone else's ideas or words, or to use someone else's creation without crediting the source. In contrast, intertextuality is defined as a complex interrelationship between a written composition and the texts that are essential to either the interpretation or creation of that piece. Both words require some kind of derivative relationship between an earlier and a later creation, whether the latter draws upon, references, or straight up reproduces the former. However, plagiarism implies a moral judgment and is an illicit, sometimes criminal act, while intertextuality has neither the implication nor the criminal overtones. For example, if I took Jane Austen's book Emma and wrote it out word for word and attempted to publish it under my own name, that would definitely be plagiarism. I'm not adding anything of my own, merely attempting to profit from someone else's creativity. However, the movie Clueless takes elements of the original book and reworks them for a modern audience, creating something new and original that is related to, but still separate from, Jane Austen's work. Similarly, the movie Robin Hood Men in Tights draws upon various different Robin Hood traditions, most notably Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, starring Kevin Costner and the world's worst mullet. But it is an entirely new entity. In both of these examples, I would argue that one's enjoyment of the remake is greatly increased through a familiarity with the original, but that such an understanding isn't necessarily required. Intertextuality can also include the deliberate use of characters or passages from one work in another, as well as making use of stereotypes often found in a specific genre. To return to films, for example, the Scary Movie film franchise relies on the viewer's knowledge of horror films in order to understand the humour contained within it. In this video series, I'm going to argue that the use and reuse of existing stories and themes by ancient authors falls under the heading of intertextuality rather than plagiarism. Right, now we've defined our terms, let's move on to looking at some ancient literature. To return to our initial example, that of the flood, we can see that the general story is much the same in the biblical and Mesopotamian sources. The flood narrative is preserved in several ancient Mesopotamian versions: the sadly fragmentary Sumerian narrative, an Akkadian text referred to as Atrahasis, named for the human protagonist, and Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. All tell the story slightly differently, but all agree on the main points. God decides to wipe out mankind, man receives messages from a god, man builds a boat, God floods the world, and everyone else dies. Man then floats around until land is found, at which point he gives thanks to the gods that he has survived. This is paralleled identically by the biblical narrative. These might not strike you as particularly convincing parallels, but the section of the Epic of Gilgamesh that I quoted in the introduction to this video is virtually identical to the biblical text, and shows very clearly a point of contact between the two textual traditions. Does this then mean that the composers of Genesis plagiarized from the Mesopotamian texts? You can probably guess what my answer is. No. Quite apart from the fact that there is no named author in either textual tradition to either commit or be victim to plagiarism, the writer of Genesis used the Mesopotamian motifs and narrative to create an entirely different text, one that illustrated an entirely different story. While the similarities between the two are interesting, what I find most compelling are the differences, as these show divergent worldviews and how one story can be used in different ways. The most crucial difference between the two is that the Mesopotamian narrative includes a whole pantheon of gods, while the biblical account is only monotheistic. This leads to the reframing of the polytheistic Mesopotamian stories in a monotheistic light, making Yahweh simultaneously the instigator of the flood and the saviour of humanity, whereas the Mesopotamian tradition holds one god primarily responsible for the flood and another responsible for the survival of humanity. This shift requires that, while Yahweh sent the flood, the ultimate survival of humanity was his intent all along. In contrast, the Mesopotamian narrative recounts how the survival of humanity was not intended by the gods who caused the flood, and was instead the result of the god Enki or Ea going against the divinely decreed fate of mankind. The end point of both sets of stories also reveals drastically different purposes and worldviews. At the end of the Atrahasis story, the gods create death, disease, and barrenness in order to limit humanity's numbers and so prevent overpopulation. The account in Genesis, on the other hand, contains in its ending a command from Yahweh to be fruitful and increase, spread over the earth and rule over it. Rather than mindlessly copy the Mesopotamian flood story, the writer of the biblical flood narrative took an existing story and reworked it to show the power and mercy of Yahweh, and to provide an etiology for the Israelite people. Finally, as will be discussed in the next video of this series, if the writer of the biblical flood narrative is guilty of plagiarism, then so too is the compiler of the Gilgamesh epic, a man named Sinlaiki-Unini. He similarly adapted the earlier story of Atrahasis into a new section of the Gilgamesh story, changing the text for his own purposes. We'll close with a quote from Dr. Richard Averbeck, a professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. The use of ancient Near Eastern mythological stories or motifs in the Hebrew Bible cannot be treated in a monolithic way. The writers used them in different ways for manifold purposes in numerous places without any sense of inconsistency.